I can't pay a second mortgage payment.
Connecticut is going down, and if we have a predatory electrical provider...
My son had a heat stroke.
We're waiting till October to say the kids could think about going back into the classroom.
Human sex drug traffickers should not be allowed to cross our border.
I haven't dealt with them at all over years now, literally years.
This is the Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. That was President Donald Trump downplaying his connection to former advisor Steve Bannon after Bannon's yacht arrest off Westbrook, Connecticut. You also heard Kimberly Guilfoyle speaking, or should I say shouting, at the Republican National Convention. Danbury Mayor Mark Boughton discussing a spike of COVID-19 in his city and the decision to start school online. Also, voices of Connecticut residents airing their grievances during a public hearing on Eversource rate hikes. On the panel today, I want to welcome back to the show Daniela Altamari, state government and politics reporter at the Hartford Courant. Daniela, welcome back.
Hi.
Also with us on Zoom, Kevin Rennie, Hartford Courant columnist, also former state lawmaker. Kevin, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Lucy.
And Colin McEnroe's here, host of the Colin McEnroe Show and a columnist at Hearst, Connecticut. Hi, Colin.
A spicy nutmeg state hello to you all.
You can also join us on Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. Now, today is day 3 of the Republican National Convention. First Lady Melania Trump addressed the GOP last night from the White House Rose Garden. She was the only headliner to acknowledge the pandemic and the Americans who've died. Other notable speakers this week, U.S. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina and former Secretary of State Nikki Haley, and a gun-toting couple from St. Louis, who we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Colin, from watching, what is the message from this convention?
You know, that's a hard question to answer. The playbook says that a convention for an incumbent president has to have as its central message, things are going well, reelect our guy. And that is a lot of the message of this convention. But, I mean, the reality is things are not going well. So part of the message here is things will get substantially worse if you don't reelect our guy. That was very much the message of night one. Trump began his term with a speech about American carnage, the idea being that it was a thing that was happening and he was going to end it. Now his message, particularly on night one, was that American carnage will flare up if he's gone. I mean, the difficult fact is that we've been through a year in which hospitals, coroners' offices, and funeral homes have struggled with bodies overflowing their storage areas. There's been unrest in the streets on a widespread scale not seen in 50 years, and the economy is tanked, partly because of the so-called Chinese virus, but partly because the best way to save the country would have been to have a consistent national policy on COVID from the very beginning. So when you think about it, this is almost as if Trump, when he was talking about carnage in his inaugural address, was describing a deliverable as opposed to something that he had intended to put an end to. I guess what I kept wondering last night, and I thought last night's tone was different and better, not just Melania, I think there were some other instances of that. But, you know, I mean, I'm one of these old-fashioned people who believes that the way the system works is to have good people on both sides. You know, on social media these days, it seems like the only way that you can think about partisan politics in America is to love one side and just unabashedly hate the other side. I've never felt that way. I think both sides need good people. I think the Republican convention, you know, it needs to do two things. One of them is to attempt to sell Trump to the electorate. But the other, and it's so hard to do with Trump kind of standing in the shot all the time, is to say, there's another party sitting inside this one, and this is going to be over at a certain point. And when it's over, here's what the consistent, enduring message of the Republican Party is going to be. And I think that's really, really hard for them to do, partly also because the kind of moderating voices that they might have, the sort of Mitt Romney wing of the party, is not really going to be allowed to talk very much there.
Kevin Rennie, what do you think of what Colin said?
I think a lot of it is true, and I have been struck, and I only watched pieces on Monday night. I did watch quite a bit last night, and I've just been struck at how angry they are for an incumbent party. That that anger would, if you took it to its logical conclusion, would suggest that they failed, and. You know, I know there seemed to be a bid for that one electoral vote that they think they might be able to capture in Maine's 2nd congressional district. and obviously Wisconsin. There were a lot of speakers from Wisconsin last night, and if they have to ignore the realities of what's going on economically in the United States. Certainly, there is no V-shaped recovery that was talked about in March and April, and so if you don't have those things, you emphasize your anger at your traditional adversary and impute to them powers that they do not possess.
When you talk about anger, do you think, Kevin, that they're trying to appeal to what they believe is their base, a bunch of angry Americans that aren't happy with a country led by Democrats?
Yeah, well, I think we're a country of 300 million people with two major political parties. Mm-hmm. So you're going to have a lot of different strains in each one. But right now, the strain that is that dominates the Republican Party is frightening, and they want others to be frightened, and they really think that fear is what will heave them across the finish line first in November.
Mm. Daniela, when you talk to Democrats in this country, a lot of them think it's frightening, the status of where our country is today. But when we want to contrast the two different conventions, there seemed to be a lot more hope and optimism at the DNC than the RNC.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain degree, conventions are just, reality shows, or they're just sort of scripted infomercials. That's been true for a long time. But I think you heard some sort of the more typical things that we saw at the DNC. For instance, Senator Tim Scott's speech where he spoke of his mother. I mean, those were sort of the more traditional elements of a political convention. But it's like the Olympics when NBC does these stories on the athletes and the adversity they've overcome and all that kind of thing. You're really trying to present a human portrait. But I think what's been said about the RNC is correct, that it really is, there's a level there of anger and of sort of stoking some of these fears that people have about the civil unrest in cities and what that will mean. We heard over and over again, Joe Biden wants to raise your taxes and get rid of the police. I believe neither of those things are actually true. And yet they were repeated over and over again by speakers last night and Monday night as well. Monday night they started with this montage of governors, particularly Cuomo and also New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, talking about the pandemic and how it was going to be over soon. And they had Nancy Pelosi going to Chinatown in San Francisco, telling people not to be afraid. Factual video clips of things that really happened. Of course, what wasn't shown was President Trump's own comments, where he, continually and for a very long time and perhaps still is doing this, downplaying the virus, saying it's going to be over. We're going to have a wonderful Easter with all the churches open. And so, again, there's just this perhaps bending of the truth in some of the imagery that you're seeing and some of the comments that you're hearing from the speakers at the RNC.
Colin, when we look at conventions in the past, can we talk about, I guess for lack of a better word, some of the stunts that were seen last night, thinking about highlighting this presidential pardon of John Ponder, also this very strange naturalization ceremony?
Yeah, that had sort of a Potemkin village quality to it. Look, conventions are full of stunts. The difference here is partly because of COVID-19, but I think to a larger degree because of the temperament and understanding of the job held by Donald Trump. You had these things which are probably, not that anybody really in America cares about this, but they're probably Hatch Act violations, using Mike Pompeo from Israel on a taxpayer-funded diplomatic mission using the White House so presidents are famous for flying to their campaign events in Air Force One and using Air Force One as a prop, as, the equivalent of kind of a scepter. Here I am, I'm the president, I've got this great plane. But it usually stops there, and legally it's kind of supposed to stop there. You're not really supposed to be using, even as Melania Trump did last night, the Rose Garden as a backdrop for one of your convention activities. I don't think that particularly tracks very well as an issue with the American public, but it is an indication. And some of it, you could argue, is a necessity dictated by the pandemic. But I do think that one of the things that Donald Trump has wanted to do in this convention is to emphasize the office that he holds. I mean, the other thing that he has sort of been, in a weird way, is, I used to sort of review all of Shakespeare's history plays to try to figure out who he was. But the truth is, in a way, he's kind of Bottom from Midsummer Night's Dream. You know how Bottom wants to play all of the parts? He wants to be in every scene. He thinks that every possible part that could be auditioned for, he tells Peter Quince, oh, I'd be good for that. There's a way in which Trump is like that, too. He cannot stand to be out of the shot. So, the first day, I think he had 3 different appearances, starting with a really long, windy speech after the morning roll call. In my lifetime, no president has done anything like this. His insistence on being ubiquitous. Usually the nominee's like the bride. You're not supposed to see them, that you can glimpse them once in this demure, coquettish shot from a luxury box, but that's about it. So this is unusual.
Kevin Rennie, you've been to national conventions. What's your take from what you've seen? Again, of course, we're in a pandemic, so a lot of it has to be virtual.
I miss the crowd that doesn't pay attention and that makes a lot of noise, and the delegates are talking to one another and not listening to the speakers. And there is something reassuringly normal about that. And this does feel, well, it looks and feels very different, but it feels so artificial. And it is, of course, the last opportunity that each party has to sort of have extended, uninterrupted access to the American people, and so they hold on to these 4 days, even though they really could do this they could do it in a day, but they certainly could do it in 2 days, and I'd be curious to see if the audience builds or just sort of gives it a shrug after a while, because it is monotonous with just one speaker after another, and you don't even have the breaks of the talking heads, at least what I've watched on CNN, and so it just feels nothing like a convention.
PBS has more talking heads if you're dying for them.
All right. Thank you.
I was just going to say that. That's how I've been watching. Kevin, is there anything about this convention or the message that's coming out of it that inspires you as a Republican, or do you think it's just falling?
Well, I think I am still registered as a Republican, but I am vehemently opposed, to this first term that Donald Trump won, and certainly a second term. I did not really see anything inspiring except that that retired FBI officer who immediately helped, and I'm sorry I don't remember his name, the man who was pardoned, who went to him right after he was released from prison and encouraged him and said, you have a big life ahead of you. I thought that was remarkable.
I thought there were a few other things. I thought the cop who adopted the baby of the woman with the heroin problem, that may have been a very glossy version of that story, but I thought it was kind of inspiring. I think you have to give Melania and whoever wrote that speech some props for taking the narrative in a different direction. I would also say a couple of interesting things. Nicholas Sandmann, the kid in the famous picture, I think he's got a point worth making about how people are just eviscerating saturated on very little detailed knowledge of their actual story by social media and sometimes by the press. And I even think the Attorney General from Kentucky, the young African American man, I think his point is worth listening to. Democrats should listen to that whole idea of don't do that Joe Biden thing and assume that if you're black, I'm entitled to your vote just on a default basis. That's an important message. If you're on the
that is a message that black Republicans have been trying to make for a long time, and he's a very good messenger.
Daniela, what about other Connecticut Republicans you've spoken with, ones that are watching from afar? What are they thinking?
Well, I think Colin, made a really good point about how, Trump is so much at the center of all of this. Traditionally you have other candidates, the Democrats certainly brought in all their past candidates, both those that were successful like Barack Obama and, John Kerry and obviously Hillary Clinton. There was no speech by Mitt Romney that, for obvious reasons, I guess, the 2012 nominee. Obviously, John McCain is no longer with us, but it's very unlikely that he would be invited. W is nowhere near there. So this is really all about Trump, and Trump is so central to this party now. They don't even have a platform anymore. They just have, we endorse whatever President Trump wants us to endorse. And that's true. That has filtered down, I think, even to the state and local level. Back about 9 months ago, before impeachment, I called every Republican town chair in Connecticut. It didn't reach all of them, and some didn't call me back. But of those I reached, only one person in a small eastern Connecticut town, and he was the acting chair, the former chair. They hadn't yet appointed somebody to replace him. He was the only one that was critical of President Trump. Every other town chairman said the president was doing a great job. You see that on the state party level as well. And you see that certainly when you talk with people in Connecticut, Republicans in Connecticut who have publicly at least completely bought into Trump. So this is now, the party of Trump 100%. And I think that's evident on every level.
I do think though that that's a syndrome that has that affects both parties. And for instance, when Ned Lamont said he didn't think the $600 weekly federal unemployment payment was necessary, Connecticut Democrats, Chris Murphy, Dick Blumenthal, they didn't say a word. But when Republicans in Congress have been would not renew it, well, they were quite vehement in their criticism of them. But the position is the same, and so that what's one reason that our public discourse has such a canyon between two sides is that no one's willing to take note of the fact that people on their own side may take stands that they don't agree with, but they're silent when that happens.
I think you're right to some degree. I do recall a very subtle tweet by Senator Murphy that some people did interpret as a swipe against the governor's comment, being tone deaf or out of touch. I may be remembering it wrong, but
I think it was in response to a Republican
but certainly within the Democratic Party, there are very public disputes about policy. There are very sharp ideological lines about, how do we handle the police? How should we deal with, the environmental crisis? Should we support Medicare for all? All those questions that I think Republicans have had more of a tendency to walk in a line, whereas Democrats have, at least in some places, perhaps not as much in Connecticut, but have publicly split over some of these issues. That's why you see Democratic primaries in Massachusetts and several places, including the Senate race there. So I don't know. I mean, I think you are correct, definitely on the larger point, but there does seem to be a little bit more dissent, a little bit more willingness to challenge folks, both personally and on ideological lines within the Democratic Party than we're seeing within the Republican Party right now. Obviously, there are people, the Republicans for Biden, and there are, we interviewed a whole bunch of them back in July, and they were critical of the president and said they weren't going to vote for him. But it's perhaps a little more muted on that side.
Can we go ahead?
I do think some of the, for instance, in Massachusetts with Kennedy challenging Markey, that seems to be more about generational ambition and get out of the way, and it's my turn. Then it's not easy to find significant differences on their policy stance.
That's true. I was thinking more of the Richard Neal race, for instance, where there are very sort of sharp differences. But you're correct, definitely in the Senate race.
We've talked about some of the politicians that have been featured at the RNC, but can we talk about the McCloskeys, this Mark and Patricia McCloskey, who spoke at the convention the other night? Likely we would never have heard of them, the St. Louis couple, but they're now being seen in some circles as heroes when they grabbed their guns and pointed them at Black Lives Matter demonstrators passing their house on the way to a rally at the mayor's house that lived in the same neighborhood. Colin, is this an odd choice, or is this exactly, again, drumming up Trump's base to come out to vote?
Well, to the extent that the first night of the convention seemed to have as its kind of working text, the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, I think they were an appropriate choice. So these are people, as far as we can tell, and this thing has been deconstructed and reconstructed a whole bunch of times, but you had essentially noisy but peaceful protesters passing the house, yelling stuff. They got out on the lawn with two guns, pointed the guns, particularly the woman with the pistol pointed the guns at the protesters. I mean, there were children in this crowd passing. And I was watching them and I was thinking, at one point, I think she said, what happened to us could have happened to anybody. And I thought, nothing happened to you. You have post-nothing stress disorder. Nothing happened to you. You overreacted to a situation. That's what happened. So they're an odd choice because I don't think that they are representative of most Americans or most Republicans. They are representative of a certain segment of the gun-owning, segment of the American population. It's kind of that. This is why we have guns, because we think someday a whole bunch of scary people are going to show up, so we want to have something to point at them. But I think they sort of fit a little bit of the tone of the first night. Ultimately, I don't know. It sort of depends on who is being spoken to, right? Who are you trying to persuade? I said last week, politics is about addition, not subtraction. So would you add any followers? Would you persuade any persuadable people by having the McCloskeys up there? I kind of doubt it.
Kevin, what do you think about the McCloskeys?
Well, I think the McCloskeys are sort of a almost perfect Midwestern version of Donald Trump's love of litigation. They are remarkably disputatious in their lives. Mark McCloskey has sued family members, and they had a long fight over a piece of property that he said he promised to him in a birthday card. They don't get along with their neighbors, and I think they're just probably really, really difficult people to be around. And they sort of revealed themselves to the world with running out on the as someone wrote, the porch, looked like something grander than a porch, with firearms while a group marched by. And from all accounts, that the group is just sort of a march that we've kind of a peaceful march that we've seen in many places.
We certainly wouldn't want them as neighbors. Daniela, we can't end the segment without talking about another interesting story with the Connecticut connection. Plenty of people got a chuckle when news broke Steve Bannon was arrested on a 150-foot yacht in Long Island Sound off Westbrook, Connecticut. Bannon, a former advisor to the president, is accused of taking $1 million worth of donations from a GoFundMe fundraising event. Donors were told the money would be used to privately fund a wall along the U.S.-Mexican border. Any ironies in this arrest? The fact that the administration is fighting over the Postal Service, and we know this arrest was carried out by postal inspectors?
Yeah, that is fitting to some degree, right? But the timing clearly, just happened when it happened. But it's interesting with the backdrop of the RNC the following week. We've seen, so many of Trump's inner circle kind of meeting the same fate. And, I'm not sure what impact it will have among voters or not. Trump, has said he hasn't talked to Bannon in a long time, and has sought to distance himself. So who knows how this will play out in November.
Another interesting part of the story, Kevin. Go ahead.
Well, that yacht belongs to the Chinese billionaire who has who fled China and has been holed up in luxury in New York, and he is a very mysterious figure, and the Chinese want him deported, and it is a complex puzzle around him. But I suspect that in addition to hearing more about Steve Bannon, we're probably going to hear more about the guy who owned the yacht, and that will probably go on beyond November, and that's probably an even more interesting and intriguing story.
Colin, you want to give the last word on Bannon's arrest?
I would say it's sort of is part of a generalized accretion of really, really bad timing for Trump. One of the problems for Trump is that his whole life and his whole coterie is so tumultuous that there aren't a lot of stretches of calm, flat water. So, heading into his convention, he's got his niece's book, he's got his sister's words on tape about him, he's got Kellyanne Conway having to leave the White House rather suddenly just because her daughter can't stand what's happening anymore. And you've got Bannon getting arrested for the corruption connected to the wall. And I would think that would be one of the last things Donald Trump would want to have in the news right now. The wall isn't close to being completed. It was such a centerpiece, both as reality and slogan for him in 2016. Finish that wall doesn't really work as well as a chant. The wall itself is plagued by questions about how the contracts were awarded. There are Defense Department investigations going on right now about whether political influence played a factor, maybe even awarding to the contracts to companies that didn't have the competence level necessary to do the job that they're supposed to do. So an arrest in connection with a grift connected to the wall, that's like, heading into your convention. You don't want that.
That's Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show, also a columnist for Hearst, Connecticut, here on the Wheelhouse. Also here with us, Daniela Altamari, state government and politics reporter at the Hartford Courant, and Kevin Rennie, Hartford Courant columnist and former state lawmaker. After the break, Eversource gets zapped by customers in a public hearing. Is there a missing watchdog for utilities in our state? We'll find out more about that. You can join us, too, on Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. This is the Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. With us today, Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show. Also, Daniela Altamari, state government and politics reporter at the Hartford Courant, and Kevin Rennie, Hartford Courant columnist and former state lawmaker. Now, the State Public Utility Regulatory Authority held an online public hearing Monday focused on Eversource's July 1st rate hike. A big increase in electric bills prompted outrage from some customers. The situation only got worse after a tropical storm in early August knocked out power to much of the state. I was at without power for 5 days. Some people were in the dark for a week. Kevin, let's talk a little bit about this informational hearing and what Eversource told lawmakers. When you think about over the last decade in terms of the storms that have hit the state and the fallout from response, what are some of the thoughts that you have about protections for consumers in our state?
Well, we have the highest electric rates in the continental United States, and so if the amount we pay should be reflected in the service we receive, something has gone wrong. And one of the problems, I think, is that for the past year there's been no consumer counsel in the Utility Regulatory Authority's office. And that's an independent office. That is because its mission is set forth in its name. It is the Consumer Counsel. It's supposed to be an advocate for consumers. There's been an acting member there for the past year, but no one who Governor Lamont has recruited, who sets forth the governor's philosophy of protecting consumers and being an advocate for consumers. It hasn't been there, and I'm not sure how important they had seen that position, although I understand they've been looking for someone. There are also 2 vacancies on the regulatory agency. The legislature expanded the number of members last year, and those new positions haven't been filled, but they could be filled by new members with a background in energy. That's not been the tradition on that in that office. There have been political people who have been placed on that commission because they're great jobs, but without a background in right now, particularly now in the complex business of generating and distributing energy, consumers are unrepresented at that important agency. And the final point I'd make on this is the PURA, which is the Utility Regulatory Agency. Their job should be rate setting. Just oversee the setting of rates. They do not need to get involved in all sorts of other policy issues. There are agencies that do that. They just need to set the rates and protect consumers.
We know that this electric utility regulation in the state is very complicated. Does that play in Eversource's favor, Daniela, when it comes time for them to seek rate hikes? And depending on who they're asking, they get their way most of the time.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those things that, perhaps public anger or public attention spikes when we, such as yourself, what a tremendous hardship, especially during the pandemic, during a brutally hot stretch, people lacking air conditioning and electricity. That's when everybody is focused on this. But, we've seen this movie before. We've been through this before many times. We lost power, I think 11 days back in 2011 when we had the ice storm. There's a lot of focus and a lot of public anger and a lot of attention of legislators and others in the moment, and then other issues it moves back to the background because the lights are on and everything's fine, and then we go through that cycle again. So it's really hard, both the complexity of the issues as you've raised, and also just the many things competing for the public's attention, that it's very hard to sort of sustain focus on this very important topic, I think.
And we can't fail to mention the powerful lobby behind Eversource. There's even state lawmakers who work for Eversource, although they recuse themselves from energy issues. Daniela, what do we know about, I know Senator Blumenthal is one of many calling for Eversource to be broken up and looking at small city specific utilities as a model. Is that even feasible?
Well, actually, Caitlin Krasel, a frequent guest here, she had a great story sort of looking at this in the Hearst papers, I think yesterday or today. I can't remember when I read it, but looking at those issues, yeah, it's a good talking point, but again, it's complicated. And, anyone who has friends who live in Norwich knows that, they do a fantastic job, small independent utility, but how do you replicate that statewide, an incredibly complex network. So I'm not sure. I would be one of those people who don't know enough about these complex issues to really weigh in to say if that's doable or not. But certainly it's something that's gaining ground, at least as a talking point.
Kevin Rennie, what legal authority would Connecticut have to break up a company headquartered out of state?
Well, we have a lot of authority over the Connecticut portion of Eversource. Remember, it was a Northeast Utilities before the companies merged, and that was in 2011. State government was silent on that merger and what its consequences might be, which was something of that significance. Their silence told you that how much influence they had, and Governor Malloy was he was not interested in these issues, and Northeast Utilities and Eversource have been huge contributors to the Democratic Governors Association, and that matters. And Northeast Utilities executives largely funded an obscure political action committee that Chris Murphy used to buy tickets to sporting events when he was in the House of Representatives. I mean, their influence is everywhere, and one of the this is not something that makes consumers very happy, but one of the things we have to realize is that every time we're told conserve energy, install renewable energy, but when we do that, Eversource comes in and says, well, more people are off the grid, we need a rate increase, and they get it, so that the public in many ways is punished for doing the right thing, and until we have a big breakthrough in how we generate energy, that's not going to change. And also, we're locked in to paying above market rates for 10 years for the energy that's generated at the Dominion plant, nuclear power plants in Connecticut. I mean, that the legislature just agreed to that, and so this summer we're paying twice as much for the energy from Dominion as we are from, for instance, natural gas.
Danielle, I believe there's another hearing tomorrow before the Energy Committee. What do you expect? Who's going to be there, and what do you expect to hear?
I actually don't know who's going to be there. But
I think CEO Jim Judge will be.
Oh, well, then that should certainly be interesting. It's like, putting him on the hot seat. And I think you'll hear a lot of tough talk from lawmakers. But again, how does that translate to action down the road? That's what we'll have to wait and see.
There are a couple of mayors who are going to be speaking also.
Well, I want to thank our panelists for talking a little bit about Eversource, and we'll keep focusing on that as these hearings continue. Again, Danielle Altamari is here with us on the Wheelhouse, state government and politics reporter at the Hartford Courant, Kevin Rennie, Hartford Courant columnist and former state lawmaker, and Colin McEnroe, host of the Colin McEnroe Show. We'll hear from him right after the break. We're going to talk about how parents and educators face some tough decisions as the school year starts soon, and Danbury's back in the news. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. This is the Wheelhouse. This is the Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. The state issued its first COVID alert on Friday after a spike in coronavirus cases in Danbury. Hundreds of new cases were reported over the last couple of weeks. Nursing homes are being tested in the city. Coronavirus testing has expanded. Parks have closed. Youth sports have been canceled. Colin, what do we know about this spike in cases, and how do you think the state and the city of Danbury has handled this? Let
me try to address both parts of this. So I think what we know about the spike is that when it first happened, just because it was such a dramatic upshot. My assumption was, because this is usually the case, that we were looking at one or two super spreader events. That's often how you go from a flat line to a line jumping up like that. It doesn't really quite seem that way. It seems a little bit more, as you just suggested, it seems a little bit more like a whole bunch of different things, all of which conspired to create more cases. In a way, I think that Danbury, this is a strange thing to say, but it's kind of a good thing that this is happening, because it's going to happen. It's going to happen more than just this one time in Danbury. And the state is going to have to figure out, and we as a society are going to have to figure out how to deal with these situations. What are we going to do, particularly when the schools really reopen in full? There are going to be some other up jumps in the infection rate. What are we going to do about this? How are we going to respond? And ultimately, what do we think a human life is worth? I mean, there's such a thing as a statistical value of a human life. Human life, it gets calculated in business all the time. Would you spend $10 million extra to make things safe enough so that one person didn't die? We're going to be looking at that in a much more chaotic and tumultuous scenario. And so I would say, just to answer the second part of your question, I think Mark Boughton's done a pretty good job here. I think he's talked very directly about what's going on. He's really encouraged people to take some of these distancing guidelines more seriously. He has talked very specifically about being at sports events where he looked up in the stands and people weren't wearing masks, etc. So, I think Mark has acknowledged the seriousness of the situation and tried to get ahead of it.
It's interesting. As we mentioned, schools just around the corner. Now Danbury won't be having any in-person classes until at least October 1st, if that happens. When we look at all the data and considerations that educators need to be focused on, Colin, what's your take on these decisions that are happening at a local level? It looks very different depending on what community you're in.
Yeah, and that's a little bit of a problem too, right? I mean, I contrast it a little bit. I don't want to say anything that will cause Josh Jabal to call me up after the show. But, I contrast it a little bit with Rhode Island. What I've read about Rhode Island, where I think they're doing walkthroughs of every single school and classroom, having experts do that. They've set up kind of a storm center, except that it's for COVID-19. I think a little bit more central coordination, or maybe even a lot more central coordination, is a good idea. That's sort of been the lesson of the last 6 months, right? The more that you have a central, coordinated, serious, understood, scientifically based set of messages, the better off you are. And leaving it to the vicissitudes of life in any particular Connecticut town does strike me as a little bit risky. And what we're hearing back from the unions is, a lot of the schools they're kind of acknowledging that they don't really have a way to keep students 6 feet apart. Some of the guidelines are just things that, even if they really, really wanted to follow them, they don't know how to do it.
Kevin Rennie, what's your take on the approach, again, local districts being able to decide, and to Colin's point, why there needs to be a central decision maker in this?
I think we're going to have to be nimble and judge this week by week, because schools have not been open for 5.5 months, and I think this is a very new experience, even though we've had the virus here, and coping with students back in school, even on a hybrid system, is we're going to have to measure it moment by moment to see what the most critical factors are as students return to the classroom. And I do think that if we're going to know what's going on town by town, and certainly the administration will know, and I think they have the experience now to react, and I do think that largely trust their judgment in this.
Daniela, how much are we really going to know, though? Because my understanding is, nothing mandates a family to alert a school district if somebody in their family has COVID.
Yeah, I think that I'm not even sure what the protocol is if if somebody in a classroom is a confirmed positive case. I mean, I think there's just going to be such a patchwork. And as you mentioned, the Denbury example is really instructive because, we were told that basically this mini outbreak or this spike in case is due to three factors: sporting events, travel, and what was the third one?
Religious.
Worship services, right? So it's interesting because those are, three places three sort of, well, travel maybe not, but the other two places have a lot of similarities with schools. And so if that resulted in a spike in cases or an increase in cases, then what's going to happen when schools open, even on a hybrid basis? What's going to happen when kids start taking the bus? What's going to happen, with all these different variables? I think you're absolutely correct. What we know now is, probably going to be woefully out of date 2 weeks from now when schools are open.
We'll have to leave it there. Time to move on to feats of strength and airing of grievances. Colin.
I'm gonna air grievances and just talk a little bit about unkindness, and I see it all over the place in all parts of the ideological spectrum. Last night, I was disturbed to read people on Twitter making fun of Tiffany Trump's appearance or the teeth of Nicholas Sandmann. When I go over and look at the CT Liberty rally people, those are the people who are opposed to almost all pandemic restrictions or even guidelines. I see people not only just rejecting the idea of wearing masks, but really refusing to engage with, and sometimes very unpleasantly, refusing to engage with the concerns of people who are immunosuppressed, immunocompromised, people who are placed in significant danger. It's important to remember, apropos of the conversation we just had, everybody's in danger all the time now. I mean, that's the reality. You don't need to have school children in your family to be endangered by these policies because we are all connected. Everybody is ultimately, by chains of exposure, exposed to everybody else. So it's important that we listen to one another, have empathy, be kind. Social media is so bad at that. So much unkindness, so much rejection of other people's points of view. I don't know why, but I'm especially depressed by it this week.
Daniela?
So I would say both a feat of strength and the opposite of that, I guess. The way Facebook and Twitter are handling the president's tweets and some misinformation. He tweeted earlier this week that there were a lot of concerns about these mail drop boxes where voters can put in their ballots. We saw them in front of town halls all over the state so people could avoid the mail and drop their absentee ballots directly in there. And Trump tweeted that, they're a voter security disaster and they could make it possible for people to vote multiple times and that they're not COVID sanitized. And he called them a big fraud. So Twitter flagged this message and basically said, this violates Twitter rules. However, we're determined that it's in the public interest to leave this open, to leave this tweet up. And then Facebook basically just flagged it with a message that said, visit our voter information center for election resources and updates. So two different social media platforms handling tweet by the president that can contain some incorrect information very differently. So I think one gets kudos for telling people that this information is false, but we still need to leave it up because it comes from the president. And Facebook saying, really just a blanket statement saying visit our voter information center, not really giving people the information they need. So I guess that's maybe a long and confusing answer, but I would say it shows the difference between these two platforms.
And Kevin Rennie, we've got under a minute. Go ahead.
This is sort of related to what Colin said, but it is a feat of strength, and that is, I feel like we're in a sort of a pause right now on how we're going to be confronting the coronavirus in the next few months. So take some time now to thank the people who have gotten us safely through to where we are, and whether it's at the grocery store for people, employees who kept showing up, or at your local bank, or your town clerk who has a big job ahead in distributing absentee ballots as sort of the front line of practical democracy.
Thank you, Kevin Rennie, Danielle Altamari, and Colin McEnroe.